Hi, it's Chris with Implied Music. We've been talking about modes, and most specifically, how to use modes transformationally, how to take a melodic phrase, a chord sequence, maybe a pattern, some sort of instrumental form of harmony, and shift it modally. Modal transformation changes the sound of a pattern in kind of magical ways. I've got 6 examples of how I use it in my own music, and stick around at the end because I've got a trick to use in Logic that will do some of that work automatically. Well, I've discussed modes in depth really many times. And if you look back in the channel, you'll find whole videos devoted to defining them. But let's do a quick review. You remember, I'm sure, that the major scale, this is a G major scale, is a series of whole and half steps. Whole, 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 half. And that set of notes defines the scale. But I don't necessarily have to decide that G is my center. For instance, if I move up to the second step of the scale and play that same set of notes, I get the Dorian mode. Each of the steps of the scale has a new set of whole and half step relationships. So here I am at C, and it goes whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. Now that means the colors of things change. The color of the scale changes, how individual steps within the scale will shift. Really depends an awful lot on sort of where the half steps are. Let's take a look at a simple pattern and subject it to a transformation. Here's a set of notes from maybe E minor, maybe it's E Dorian, right? E minor Dorian. And I'm going to play a little pattern. A modal transformation would be to shift notes to a new scale. So if I picked E major, say, the G would become G sharp. I would have to have a D sharp. Of course, the G sharp on top changes. So this becomes this. And by the same token, I could shift to E flat major. E becomes E flat. The D is the same, the G is the same. B becomes B flat, E becomes E flat, and G. So now I have this. Back to E minor, E major, E minor, Dorian, E flat major. Well, that sort of stopped rolling on us visually, but did you hear the sort of dynamic shift? It's like rain in a beautiful sort of way. Well, I've got 6 examples of this sort of thing, so let's dive in. My first example is very similar to what we just did, kind of an F major, F minor world. And you can see the sort of trilling F major chord and then the F minor chord here. And I'm going to just add some notes on the top. The hands sort of interlock a little bit, right? So that C on top will come back in a moment. F and F minor. The A's become A flat. The E's become E flat. Add the C on the top for a little more spice. And then back home again. There really is only 2 scale systems. Depending on how many notes are sort of packed into the system, the scale may sound like a major scale. It might sound like a Lydian version of the major scale. It might have a modal quality. so often when we use more than 3 or 4 notes in a chord within a few moments, right, like a pattern like this, we're not gonna have a straightforward major scale. It'll have it might feel jazzy, but it's not really jazzy, is it? But it certainly will have some of that energy of a mode. Let's go on to the next example. Well, this example is a kind of a contrary motion arpeggio, and we're just gonna shift things around. I guess you just would say a sort of a C sound. So we'll have C major 7, C minor 7. You'll see how it works. So here's my ascending C major 7 over E and my descending one, and they're going to happen at the same time. The hands are moving towards and out and towards and out. So we went from C major to, I guess, a sort of a C sharp minor sound, E major 6. They're the same notes. E flat major is like C minor. E flat minor is a version of the same thing. A good deal of what makes this work to our ear is that individual notes within the pattern shift by just a step, very often just a half step. Of course, in good voice leading, that's what we look for. We look for the voices in a chord to move by just a step or a half step. And in a way, we're tricking our ear, the listener's ear maybe, to accept a rather radical shift, a shift from C major to E flat major is a radical shift. But if I shift individual voices by just a step, a half step even, that shift becomes somehow validated, justified. Our ear smoothly travels with it. And it's an epic sound. It can be very exciting, especially when in strings or, well-voiced woodwinds. Let's go to our next example. Well, before we go on, if this is the second or third video of mine you've seen and, you're getting something out of the channel and you're not subscribed, now's the time to subscribe. We're building a community of composers and songwriters, of producers, people interested in using music theory. And this is sort of music theory, but it's not really an academic music theory. It's music theory for everyone, for someone who wants to make some sort of plan and understand what they're doing already, have something useful that they can go forward with, for composers and musicians who are interested in becoming their own theorists. And I really believe that every creative musician should have a music theory that's their own. And that's what I'm trying to do here on this channel. I hope it's successful, and I hope it'll be useful for you. Well, let's go on. It's kind of an E minor, and then with some notes injected. It's an easy 3 against 2 pattern, and we're shifting E minor, E flat major. We're going to go up to E major. This is the same trick that we just used in the last piece. And again, those half-step shifts make everything work. No melody on the top exactly, but what a lovely set of colors. Strong dissonances don't bother me in this context at all. Let's go to the next example. Here's another interlocking hands arpeggio pattern. The left hand has 3 notes going up. The right hand, 3 notes coming down and kind of tucking in. And they're going to work together to create this texture. Another E minor 9 or even 11 texture. And then a shift, brightening it up, a couple of sharps. Basically kind of going around the circle of fifths here. We're going to add another sharp, and when we do, we've just rotated the clock around the circle. And there's going to be one more. Now, I guess we would say maybe like a B major scale. So many black keys. One way to train yourself to do this is to grab a handful of notes and then ask yourself the question, if these 6 notes were in the key of G, what would I have to change? The F would have to become F sharp. Now, these 6 notes. If these 6 notes were in the key of B flat major, what would I have to change? B would become flat, E would become flat, F sharp would become F natural. So I get a set of notes that arguably could be from C, arguably could be from G, could be from B flat. And I can set a series of sort of stations, as it were, kind of a Markov chain of modal destinations, or they're not really key signatures, but they're sort of tonal centers that use a modal sound, or maybe you could say maybe a key signature sound. I think of it as a modal sound. So for instance, if I decided I wanted to go G, B, E flat with that same system, G, B, E flat. Interesting, right? Let's go to the next example. Here's a series of A9 arpeggios. There's the minor, the major, and then A flat. It's still an A, but it's A flat. And I'm going to tuck some kind of D and some kind of F, depending on the scale, into that. The D has to become D sharp. I've decided it's an E major scale that A major chord comes from. This kind of thing has nothing to do with functional harmony, no tonic-dominant relationships at all. And yet there's a kind of a motion to it, isn't there? Well, I've got one more example, plus I did promise you that logic trick at the end. Well, this is a sort of a twisted version of what we've been looking at, because I've allowed myself a certain amount of freedom in the last chord, and I just love the way these chords work. So you could say C major, C sharp minor, A flat major. It's almost like a weird cadence, isn't it? I've put the melody in the bass. And that melody has to change to fit the scale of each chord. Something that was an E flat has to become an E natural. In a way, this is what jazz musicians do when they improvise over chord changes, isn't it? Fun. All right. So what about this logic trick? Here's an arpeggio in E Dorian, like D major. Lovely. Now, all those notes are from D major, and I have a lot of notes from D major in there. Do I have all of the notes from D major in there? I do. And if I select them all, I can go to the left of my edit screen and select a quantization for the scale that's not what I originally played. So let's travel over to the left-hand side of the edit window. And I've got this set up already. It's scale quantized to D major. But what if I scale quantize it to a different key? Let's say E major. Well, notes will change. What if I quantize it to E flat, natural minor? Again, things change. I can experiment with this play around, see what I get. Most of the time, it does a pretty good job of making all those minor adjustments. I wouldn't rely on it as a hard and fast composer's assistant and invariably successfully, because sometimes notes need to be changed. Just, you listen to it and you're like, I don't like it. And also, it'll make wrong choices. It'll say that E is going to become a kind of an F when you wish it became an E flat instead. And those are the kinds of things that you'll just have to manually play around with it. But like, it's a very interesting approach to shifting patterns in a way that can be experimental and sort of fun. It takes a little bit of time. You got to know your scales. You got to know what your ear is telling you, but it's well worth it. This whole process for me is an awful lot of fun just to play around with. I enjoy doing it as a pianist with my hands. I like working on the DAW with this kind of stuff. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Like and subscribe, ding the bell to be notified when I do my videos, and I'll see you next time.